Welcome to this special ILEETA Learning Lab podcast. The Learning Lab is one of the ongoing professional development benefits for members of ILEETA, the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association. ILEETA is an organization dedicated to advancing the law enforcement profession through the development of trainers and educators and the sharing of information, research, strategies, principles, and concepts related to effective teaching and learning. The Learning Lab currently contains over 150 interviews with ILEETA members on a wide range of topics related to advancing law enforcement training. In an effort to share the experience and knowledge of ILEETA members with everyone in the law enforcement training community, we are publicly releasing some of these interviews in a bi-weekly podcast. After listening to this interview, we encourage you to go to ILEETA.org, that's ILEETA.org, and find out how you can become a part of this community of trainers dedicated to serving the heroic men and women of the law enforcement profession by investing in their professional development in order to provide the best possible training. Please enjoy this interview and feel free to contact us at info@ileeta.org if you have any questions. I'm Brian Willis, the Deputy Executive Director for ILEETA and your host for the ILEETA Learning Lab. Now, Season 3 of the Learning Lab has posed a number of challenges, first with the rescheduling of the conference from March to August because of COVID, and then having to cancel the 2020 conference outright because of COVID-19. This interview is one of a series recorded after the conference was canceled, and I reached out to ILEETA members who were scheduled to present at the conference and asked if they would be gracious enough to be willing to discuss the key concepts from what would have been their conference presentations. And today's interview is with Geoffrey Desmoulin. And Dr. Desmoulin offers, we're talking about the science of violence, considerations and use of force investigations. And Dr. Desmoulin offers biomechanical consulting services on behalf of clients throughout North America as well as abroad. Focus practice areas include injury biomechanics, incident reconstruction, and physical testing with a subspecialty in the science of violence. Dr. Desmoulin has been retained in significant complex injury litigation cases involving municipal police department use of force, violent encounters, and Taser International, to name just a few. So, Jeff, welcome to the ILEETA Learning Lab.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Now, in your class description, it says combining quantitative tools of the engineer and the scientist with the use of force spectrum, we will provide you better understanding of human conflict interactions. This interactive lecture exposes you to the confusing nature of human physiology, decision-making, and injury causation during high-stress and deadly force encounters. You will have the opportunity to work through a mock investigation using biomechanical data. This course highlights how science now assists in proving or disproving use of force incidents and why courts are now regularly accepting this expert evidence. Now, obviously, we're not going to be able to work through a mock investigation here, but this is a really interesting field, and I think it's different from what a lot of people think of. I think when they think of science, they're thinking of behavioral factors and or human factors, but what you do is different, correct?
I agree, Brian, and thanks for pointing that out. I think there is, it sounds like a lot of gobbledygook. It sounds complex, but it's because we're approaching the same problem from a slightly different angle. And in particular, we combine the skill sets of the human scientist or kinesiologist or physician with the engineer. And when you do that, you really create a whole new discipline. So, for example, we get excellent information from physicians, medical examiners, coroners on all of these use of force events and violent encounters. But all too often, or I should say, what doesn't happen enough is that information kind of gets lost in the investigation. And we actually look at the injuries as a source of independent information for investigations rather than just a result of the incident itself. And while there may be some aspects used, it's not used to where it really could be. And that's where the engineering comes in. So the physician will take a look at what happened from the point of injury moving forward in time. And that's their job, and they're very well trained at it. They have a look at that injury and how can we improve prognosis moving forward in time. But using the tools of the scientist and the engineer, as long as we understand that injury and understand what the medical examiner has documented for us, we can now move from that point of injury backwards in time to figure out what happened and what caused that injury. And that, let me tell you, if you can describe the location, direction, and magnitude of the load that caused that injury, you know 90% more about what happened during that incident than a lot of other investigators. And I know that's a big thing to say to this community, but if you hear me out, if you take our course, I think you can see that the team between the medical expert, the detective, and biomechanics is almost an unstoppable force.
And it strikes me that that's such a key piece, and perhaps a missing piece is that we're missing that engineering piece. That we're looking at behavioral science, but not necessarily the science around the engineering. And as you talked about, moving backwards. And so, talk about the key to understanding location, direction, and magnitude of that injury. And does that help us to understand what actually then transpired in the use of force event?
100%, Brian. Let me put it this way. A lot of the times I'll get phone calls. I'm getting phone calls more and more from detectives all the time where they have a file, and often they just want to chat about it. And they'll say, look, this is what happened. This is what this person is saying what happened. Here's a list of injuries. And I'm pretty sure this person's not telling me the truth, but I don't know how to go about framing the argument. And that becomes where we now can pick up the pieces, because data will help you bridge gaps that are missing in the case materials. And the way we do that, we don't extrapolate, which is going outside the data set. We do what's called interpolating, whereas we work within the data set. So, for example, a very easy one is an officer-involved shootings is wound paths, and this is something that I think is logical for most people. It's not rocket science, but if you have a wound path, it's telling you a very good piece of information, because it's telling you the alignment of the, let's call it a pistol, and where it was aimed and where it was located, or at least the trajectory of where it was located in three-dimensional space. But we're also getting relative information now of where that body part was located with respect to that pistol during time of discharge. And this is kind of how we start to back out the information from the injury. So we start there, and often we'll get very good information from the medical examiner, where you'll get the distance from the head to the entrance wound, and then distance from the head to the exit wound. And that now gives you an orientation that you can start playing with these things. And there's only so many ways, like if you follow that trajectory, there's only so many places that person or the shooter could actually be. And you start to narrow these things down. And so wound path would be one. If it passed through the body and ended up in a floor somewhere, that's something that can be tested. And often it's not. And there's traditional ways of testing bullet defects, as you know, with the ellipse method, trajectory rods, etc. But if that round has interacted with a medium before it made that defect in whatever material, let's call it drywall, you can't use those traditional methods to start backing out the trajectory from that defect. And so how do you piece all this stuff together? And that's where we can interpolate using the tools of the engineer and the scientist. And typically that means, it can mean fancy software packages that have in the order of $70,000 US annual license fees. They're not just an amped up version of Microsoft Word or Microsoft Office. They are a physics-based program that give you significant advantages over people that don't know how to program them, but also they come with limitations as well, and you have to know what those limitations are so you can use them properly. And that's just one example. Another example is that, well, if we can't use these traditional methods of tracking trajectory, well, what else is there? Well, then we have to kind of go kick it old school and go to the lab, design an experiment to figure out exactly where that bullet was in space when it made that defect. And it's important to do these things because, as you know, it's one thing to get the information right, but it's a whole nother thing when you think you're using the right method and that method's actually giving you incorrect information. And now you start to take a tangent on the truth. And that becomes, something that makes the file even more complex. And we've had that before. There's files that have landed on our desk where an investigator comes with a particular tool set and starts to go down a path that is incorrect. And to back that out is actually more complex than kind of starting with the scientific approach to begin with. And I'm sorry, I know I'm rambling, but I do want to talk about the basic premise of the scientific method because it's so important when it comes down to this. A lot of this stuff that I'm talking about sounds complex. It really isn't. It just comes down to the scientific method. And let's just review that very quickly for a moment because it all stems from that. You create a hypothesis. So let's say, for an example, there's a narrative, and often in violent encounters, there is only one narrative. So that narrative now becomes your hypothesis. And in science, you test against that hypothesis. Okay, so you design experiments to figure out if you can dispel this hypothesis. And if you can't dispel it, then according to science, you must accept it. Now, obviously, depending on what court we're in, whether it's a civil trial or a criminal trial, the amount of confidence around accepting or rejecting a hypothesis changes because we're either working on the balance of probabilities or beyond a reasonable doubt. And the balance of probabilities, in my mind, is 50th percentile confidence. So is this more likely to have happened or not? And that's actually a fairly loose rule to, believe it or not. But in criminal trials, beyond a reasonable doubt, in my mind, is 95th percentile. That's kind of the research level of confidence. If someone wants to go to jail for this, you better make sure you know what you're talking about. And so that kind of dictates the number of trials, the rigor of how you answer or how you test against that hypothesis. But it all stems from that, Brian, and nothing more. And then it really matters what tool set you have to bring to answer that question.
Excellent. Great explanation. And it's interesting you talk about that, creating the hypothesis and then testing against the hypothesis. I just happen to be reading a book called Think Like a Rocket Scientist right now, where that's what he talks about, is you try to disprove your hypothesis. And as opposed to what most of us do is, like you say, we create a theory and then we're trying to prove that we're right. So
true.
It seems to me that what the science that you have does is it takes away some of the confusion, and that may not be the right word, around the human memory. So we have an officer that says, well, this is what happened. A subject says, well, that's not what happened. This is what happened. The officer did this to me, and this is how I got hurt. Does this scientific method and this scientific and mechanical or engineering approach help to break away that opinion and say either this is reasonable that this happened or this is the most likely way that this injury would have occurred, as opposed to just relying on human memory?
We're getting there, Brian. Yeah, you're starting to talk my language. Yeah, you're hearing me, which is nice, and I appreciate that. Most people don't. But you're absolutely right that we, by definition, I tell my guys, I said, do not get inside the shooter's head. Do not get inside anyone's head in this encounter. We have to look at only observable behavior. That is measurable. That is something that we can speak to. As far as perception and where he or she may have seen this within their field of view, that is, I believe, a very dangerous area for most experts to go. And I think plaintiffs' attorneys and prosecutors are getting better and better and better at arguing these points. And so what that means is the people that are going to go there, if you will, and get inside the officer's head or somebody's head has to be just that much more credible. And so it's narrowing the field of people that actually can comment there. And in my opinion, my humble opinion, I'm not an expert in that, and I'm not a behavioral scientist, but I believe that the people that should be talking about that are people that have the years of education to know where to limit how their opinions and also be true experts in that field. And of course, Force Science has carved this out as their space for years now. And I've worked with Bill, and more recently, he gave me three hours at his annual conference in 2019. Unfortunately, it was canceled this year. But what I like about what they're doing is that they're building skill set in that area with people who have now experience in these incidents. And that now is a very new, credible way. And I shouldn't call it new, but I'm kind of old school, and I think the courts are a little bit old school in the sense that they tend to limit the officer's opinion in this area for the fact that, well, you're involved, of course, or you're a former officer, of course you're defending this officer's actions. And without criticizing anyone here, Brian, I just think there's so much at play here that you really need to have the years of education behind you and the research behind you in order to know where to stop. And that's where our course, I think if it does anything with biomechanics, does that very, very well. Because we cover the fundamentals of physics. We go over Newton's 3 laws. We go over Ohm's laws. And if you look at these fundamental aspects of physics, you'll realize fairly quickly it's probably grade 10 math, maybe even grade 8 math. And so you might think to yourself, well, why isn't everybody doing this? And not everyone's doing this is because once you start to apply these relatively simple equations to real world scenarios, you realize that you have to start applying assumptions. You have to start thinking about, well, there's a magnitude related to this equation. There's a vector related to this equation, and how does this vector actually apply in this real world scenario? And it becomes extremely complex, extremely fast. And I think that anything inside the heads of the people that were actually there during the incident is even exponentially more complex. And so, and I'm not sure if I'm answering this question, but I just think we have to be careful who's defending those areas and who's talking or speaking or opining in those areas, because it's highly complex and it's getting, the people that are formulating arguments against it are getting better and better at it. And so I think we just need to continue training, continue raising the bar, and then continue pushing forward, because I am so sorry, Brian. I think I've lost the point here, but what I'm saying is that human factors is complex, and the people that are opining there need to be thoroughly qualified. And the way we approach the system is we'll say, yeah, okay, we'll dovetail with that, but we prefer to look at the observable behavior. And there's always a human factors section to our reports and our investigations, but it never relies on psychology. It always relies on observable behavior, which at the end of the day is actually quite similar across most humans in these types of situations. And it's never a finite number. It's always a range based on the scenario. But when I talk about these ranges, I'm talking about the results of specific research. But again, you're now taking a laboratory scenario and applying it to a violent encounter that's rapidly unfolding in a highly dynamic situation. And so you have to be very careful how you do that, even if you are outside of that human's brain. So, and hopefully I didn't confuse you, but that's my feeling on it, and that's how we approach it, and that's why we're a little bit different to what most people are doing in this area.
Well, no, I think it's a great explanation, and I think it speaks to the fact that it goes back to this team approach, and I think that we're starting to understand that more and more, and the courts are better educated, and you're not there to testify on behalf of prosecution or defense. You're there as a friend of the court to educate the court, the triers of facts, about what the realities based on the science are. And I think it's a very good point that we need to know where to stop. I know Jonathan Hack, a former chief crown prosecutor from here in Calgary, who teaches around the world on issues around video and does work with experts and expert witness, speaks very much to that point from a video perspective. So you need to, as a forensic video analysis, you need to know where your guide rails and or your guardrails are, and where to stop. And so I think that the piece where one expert stops, maybe another expert like yourself has the ability to come in and help us to understand some of these dynamics. Because do you find that people have, they make assumptions about, well, this injury, so it must have happened this way, and that's strictly based on watching too many television shows or whatever it is, Grey's Anatomy, or as opposed to understanding the science and the biomechanics of these issues?
Oh, Brian, we only have an hour, but, you talked about video, and now we're talking about people coming up with theories around how injuries are formed. And let's just address the first one, the injuries. That's so interesting, because I can't tell you how many Zoom calls I've been on in the past little while where somebody will get up in front of the camera, start positioning themselves, and then using fingers and pens and trajectory rods to tell me or explain their theory. And you can imagine how stupid it gets, and it gets real stupid really, really, really quick. And so to be able to, and what people aren't realizing is that the human body is actually, you can treat it as a material. And so engineering and materials science, for that matter, has done experiments on tissues forever. And it treats it as materials. And we're building on a set of research for about 65 years. And these are things that people didn't even know existed. And so skin, for example, has been experimented on, muscle has been experimented on, bone. And so you can actually, and we can even boil this down to the minor injuries like abrasions and contusions. In fact, we came up with a quantitative method to measure a contusion, and we use it all the time in our investigations because it's very easy to use and test against various narratives. But when you can quantify something, you can you know much more about it, and if you know much more about it, it starts to become very clear which narrative is most likely to have occurred. So I would push people down the road that, look, you need to find the scientific literature to back up this theory. And of course, in our courses, we go through this, and in our longer courses, we actually show you how to do it. And it's not just from literature. There's Excel files that we'll give out that isn't rocket scientists, but it is very credible ways on to figure out the threshold of a failure of a specific tissue in a specific manner. Because it's not just, as I mentioned before, location, direction, magnitude. It's not just magnitude. Most people focus there. But it's how did this contact actually occur? Was it a tangential motion across the skin, or did it come in at right angles to that particular body part? And that now you can see starts to give you much better information about what actually happened between the two people than two conflicting narratives between the two people.
Absolutely. And it seems to me that there's that gap. You mentioned doctors before, so whether it's a pathologist at an autopsy or an emergency room physician, they're saying these are the injuries, and then we're trying to, it seems to me that you fill in the piece about how those injuries were likely to happen, which is something that we're very often trying to figure out, but is a missed piece in a lot of these investigations. Is that accurate?
It really is. And thank you for noticing that. I think the physicians are too far removed from the incident, and their expertise is to kind of document the injury and understand it from a treatment point of view. Even though cause of death is one thing that they will comment on, it's typically summarized in, quite often in the emergency room as a box maybe the size of my thumb. They'll say MVA, fall from ladder, gunshot wound. These are the descriptions that you're getting on cause of injury. A medical examiner might expand that to, describe the wound path much more clearly with respect to the organs involved. And then they might summarize that with saying that this was the lethal shot, or this one was not lethal, etc. And that adds to it, but it still really doesn't bridge the gap between what the detective understands, what the physician understands, and a full reconstruction of events. And that's where I do believe we fit very, very well. And we can take that information, step it backwards in time, utilize the interviews from the detective are actually hugely important, because that's one thing. I can't stand human memory because it's always wrong. And I can give you tons of examples of how our reconstructions were correct, and then, or I should say, we're being questioned, and then all of a sudden, a dash cam footage of the incident surfaces and kind of confirms our thoughts, which is really, really interesting. That's part of the things we touch on in our course. But to dial back a bit is when you can lock somebody into a narrative 5 different ways, and detectives are extremely good at doing this, it makes it extremely difficult for them to change their narrative once things start to be revealed. And it's amazing how they will not know that they're locking themselves into a key piece of information that we need to confirm our hypothesis. And just things like, both people being in the room at the same time when the fight started, rather than one person being in the hallway and the other person being inside the room. And so we'll be able to narrow this down to 2 narratives. One is the person had to have been either outside the room or inside the room at the time of the first shot. Well, the person that ended up living is now telling us that the fight didn't even start until both people were inside the room. So we can discount that one narrative. And that, that's something that they just couldn't have seen coming, and was extremely helpful in us narrowing down our range of possibilities. So you're absolutely right. Using the information from the medical examiner, the detective, and the engineering approach that we bring is I think, absolutely key.
And it seems to me that the sooner that we can involve the science that you do, before we get locked into our own theory and are proceeding and spending a lot of time trying to prove our theory, rather than collecting all the facts, the data, the evidence, and then working through all these different processes to try and determine what the evidence actually proves or tells us. Is that part of it, that we need to be cautious as investigators sometimes about getting too locked into a theory too early when we don't understand some of the mechanics of this?
I'll be honest, Brian, I find that detectives are pretty good not getting locked in. What ends up happening is later on there will be a piece of evidence that they'll hang on to, and it starts to and then, as you said earlier, people want to kind of prove that theory right. But these people are well trained, they're well experienced, and I don't find that as much. But here's one thing that I think can really, really help the entire industry is scans are cheap and almost they're not as widespread as they should be. Now, granted, there's a very expensive upfront cost with these devices. So the Faro machines, even total stations are really, really good. But, and we have a scanner here, just a handheld jobby that is good enough for, say, a room and a hallway. And we could do an entire house if we wanted, although it would be a bit more laborious than say, a Faro device. But these things are portable. And the initial cost, as long as you can get over the initial cost, they're very cheap and easy to use. And because often you don't know what's going to be important, and that's okay. Nobody can walk into a scene and figure out exactly what happened until you work it up properly. But so often things are missed in the documentation process that doesn't allow us to go back. And we're sitting there, months later, 6 months to a year later, thinking, oh, man, it would have been so nice to just, if we could just characterize what was in this corner a little better, we'd have a better idea as to what happened. Or even sometimes evidence will come in and I'll have descriptions of where the blood was found, but there's no correlation between the descriptions of where the blood was found and the photographs at the scene. So if we had a scan, we could now very easily link, and most of these scans are set up this way. They'll come with software where you can integrate your photographs within the scan, and you could now much more easily link, say, DNA evidence to a three-dimensional scaled scan of a scene. And let me tell you, that becomes so important with reconstruction. And I believe that would be one of the number one take-homes that I would recommend is just get yourself a scanner, get your department a scanner, have your reconstruction people be communicating with your homicide groups so that you can now use these skill sets and document scenes, within hopefully minutes of the incident actually occurring. And that's where a lot of this information, I think, is lost.
Excellent. And it seems to me that that's an evolution, is that as we learn more, we learn the importance of capturing all of that data early so that as we progress, you can't go back and recreate these things, or you can't go back to the start. What you get at the initial stages is what you have to live with. Is that one of the issues?
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think you're ever going to get pushback on first responders trying to make the scene safe, or, if the person survives the incident, that EMS, moves things. And obviously they get trained on, if it looks like a crime scene, you shouldn't touch anything or focus on the body at least. And what I'm finding actually is that that's getting through to first responders, is that they aren't moving the scene as much as they used to, and they're getting very wise as to pull out their phone and just as they walk into the scene, they're filming, they're taking pictures. And let me tell you, that's so useful, because now that can be added to a series of photogrammetry photos where you're creating a 3D model of something that was there that perhaps got moved, but now you've got some photographs of it as the first responders enter the scene, and you know exactly where it was, and not only do you know exactly where it was, you now can create a three-dimensional model from it. So that's getting better. But as you know, there's always missing pieces of the puzzle, and sometimes that doesn't happen, and sometimes that can play a key role. 6 months, a year down the road, where you're like, oh man, if we just had gotten this, we'd be so much better off. But that's why we still need humans to investigate these things, and that's why science is plays a large role in this. And but it is getting better, and I'd say that the police are probably some of the best data sets and investigations that we see that come across our desk.
Absolutely. And, the challenge for some, and there's so many small agencies, and it's not a knock on small agencies. Some of them have great investigators, but some of them might only investigate a very small number of murders or shootings in their career, whereas other people are doing it on a daily or a weekly, or if you live in Chicago, they're doing it on an hourly basis. Now, is another part of the way that your science helps us is that after the first shot, after the first strike or the first impact, do we get confused about subsequent injuries because we don't understand always how the human body is going to react to that first strike or to that first shot? And so we say, well, they executed them because of where that second or third shot entered, because we don't understand how the human body is going to respond to the force from the bullet or the force from a physical strike or some type of takedown.
Well, Brian, you've come leaps and bounds in the 45 minutes we've been talking. That is so incredibly on point. I can't even tell you. When there are catastrophic injuries, even the medical staff will not document the minor associated injuries. But those minor associated injuries are telling you so much about the interaction, the contact that was made, that and I'll tell first responders this now, please, please, please document. Just pull out your phone, start filming. And inevitably, the injuries will get covered. And that's so important, because sometimes they're even missed by the medical staff. Medical examiners are better because their job is to go kind of head to toe, and you'll pick up the abrasions. But I can tell you, on that point alone, we have solved, or at least helped, we've used as little as just a couple abrasions as independent sources of information to validate our reconstruction in OIS defense. So these things are incredibly important, and yes, it absolutely matters.
Now, is your experience when you take some of this information to court that you're hampered by people watching CSI 20 or 30 times a week? Or does some of that understanding of the basic science help people to better understand what you're explaining to them when you go to court and give your evidence?
Great question. And I would have to say yes and no. Yes, in the fact that there's an expectation that things are going to be fast, easy to understand, and highly visual. That's the CSI effect right there. The problem with giving something fast, easy to understand, and visual is that it's not always correct. And it's easy to kind of be a magician in front of a jury, if you will. And there are experts that will do this. And so you have to be, and here's the thing on the opposite side, if you're trying to explain something scientifically and it becomes too complex, you're going to lose your audience. And we actually have a mantra here that if you confuse, you lose. And so it has to stay within that fast, visual, and simple to understand genre to have it be understood and believed by the jury and lawyers and judges that are on the file trying to make decisions about it. But there has to be credible science that backs that up. And as long as that's there, and as long as you can explain it, it's actually okay that people don't understand it, because you've already given them the easy to understand visual and kind of quick response. As long as you give that, that's fine. Then you can go all day long on a cross-examination, getting into stuff that people don't understand. But if it sounds credible, they're going to believe the easy-to-understand aspect of it. And so it doesn't become this argument between two engineers. It becomes an argument between who can present the information best and then who can back that up and is most credible with the scientific component of it. So it's a bit of a tricky game. So, but that's what we try to do.
And so
give something visual and easy to understand, but then back it up credibly.
And so is part of what you do then is that you would create, say, simulations on a computer showing, the human body and it reacting to each of those elements to show that this is, beyond a reasonable doubt, the likelihood of how this transpired and how these injuries occurred?
100%. We use standard video. We use high-speed video. We use diagrams, we use scans, we use thermal imaging, if you can believe it. And I'll explain why we do that in just a second. We have used X-ray at some point. We use photogrammetry. So you have a series of photos of an object now. You can make a three-dimensional object. We use engineering CAD programs. So there is that wealth of ways to visualize that information. And I can tell you that a lot of these are being boiled down, sadly, to an animator's interpretation of an investigator's theory. That is the one thing that is being presented all too often and can get ripped apart left, right, and center. Where you want to move that visualization is towards the engineering programs. Okay, so things like LS-DYNA, these scaled scanning programs, photogrammetry, obviously with the known dimensions within frame, CAD programs. Matimo is another one. Zygote model is another one. Like, there's just a wealth of these things that have data incorporated in the file itself. Now, they're very expensive. I'm not going to lie. They're ridiculously expensive. They're not user-friendly. So typically you have to have not only an engineer that understands how the program works, but somebody who's actually practiced at using it. But these things are very visual. They can be as visual as the graphic interpretation, but they're based on data. And that's what makes them much more powerful in the court of law, in my opinion. And I believe the courts are moving towards that response, because all too often you can have two narratives that are illustrated by a graphic artist, and it's nothing for them to put a little video together that shows people jerking up and down from bullets hitting them and falling one direction with respect to another. And here's the thing. We all believe it because of that CSI effect, because we've seen this in Hollywood and we've been led to believe that that's what happens when a bullet hits a human body. But in fact, I can tell you that the momentum of a bullet hitting the body is actually very low, and not that much more of me poking you with my finger in your chest. And so if there's a lot of forward momentum there, it's not going to make much difference. If it's hitting, say, a wrist that's moving with the bullet, that might make a difference. Or if it's, say, hitting, perhaps this is a bit of a graphic example, but the head at the outside point of its axis of rotation. Now I'm starting to talk like an engineer, but I'm telling you that's where the torque's going to be. And so even a low momentum placed at that, you can think of it like a wrench. Intuitively, it's easier to turn a nut if you hold the wrench further out than closer to the nut, right? That's what's happening. And so you can have some influence. So it depends. And again, this is where it gets complex, and you have to start making assumptions. You have to understand, mechanically what's happening in that particular situation, and that will allow you to choose the right program to demonstrate what it is you want to demonstrate. And of course, that's got to be a key component of the investigation. So hopefully that answers your question.
Absolutely, and it's one of those things that we try and impress upon officers in basic training is that when you shoot a human being with a handgun round, it's the outcome is pretty unpredictable. We see people get shot in the face and don't even flinch, just keep going. And but people are programmed by television and the movies that when you shoot them, they're going to fly back through the air. And it's very common that officers say, "Well, I thought I was hitting them, but I thought I must have been missing because they weren't reacting like they do on television." And so you run into that same issue with juries and judges. Now, talking about video, we have more and more video of incidents. And again, video is one of the challenges that people don't understand all of the limitations around video.
Oh, man.
How helpful or unhelpful is video to you? Or does it really depend on the quality of the video? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh man, Brian. Yeah, amazing. This is another deep dive we do on our longer course. As you know, video experts are becoming more and more popular to use because there are so many complications. I'm not going to get into the hash, what the hash number means or anything like that, but I want to get a little bit more applied and what might your user base actually be able to take home. And that is, most people think of video is giving me time and spatial information. Okay, so I watch this video, 30 seconds of it, I see this incident. So most people will say, well, I see what's happening there because I see this person moving through the frame over a certain amount of time, and they're located at a certain position within that frame. Okay, and they just kind of piece it together in their brain, and they think they know what's happening. But really what video is, and I hope people appreciate this, is its frames per second, okay? And that may be 60 frames per second if you're talking about a GoPro. It may be 30 frames per second if you're looking at security footage. It may be 30,000 frames per second if you're looking at one of our high-speed videos. What video is, it's a series of images, okay? And more often than not, when somebody's trying to argue a video and what people think they see, is they'll show a slide or they'll show a frame from that video and they'll say, how on earth can you tell me that this frame expresses what you think you saw? And you know what? They're not wrong. And so what is happening with video is it's being taken as a whole, and when really it should be taken as a series of images. And so now those images, the way I like to explain it, it's like noise in a scanner, okay? So if you have the optimal conditions for that image, you will get a pretty clear picture of what's happening in that image in that moment in time. So for example, if I take 10 independent observers and they take a look at that one image, and if it's what I call a low noise image, 9 out of 10 or even 10 out of 10 of those observers would be able to explain what they think is happening. So there's a shoe located here by this curb. This hand I can see is holding this particular object, et cetera, et cetera. That would be what I call a low noise image. Now you can advance maybe even one frame, and all of a sudden, those same 10 observers are interpreting that frame completely different. And I can't tell you how many times we've been in the middle of an investigation, and I have lawyers on the call, I have former police officers on the call, I have a video expert on the call, and now a biomechanics person, and we're all saying, 5 different things. And so what our job is to take the low noise images, okay? So the ones where 9 or 10 independent observers would say the same thing about those images, and we piece those together with a theory of how we think this unraveled. And we video that independently of that incident video. Now we've got an objective view of what those independent frames are telling us of the incident video. And we can do that. Let's say that the incident video is low light, for example. Well, we can recreate those low light conditions in our validity filming, and we can overlay a thermal image. So I talked about thermal imaging before, and that's super, super important because that thermal image is telling you exactly where that human is in three-dimensional space. And you can overlay that with your theory video in low light conditions. And that's how you'd piece it together. And most people don't see video that way. And it's you know, once I kind of get through this, people will say, holy macro, that's actually kind of cool. And we see what you're talking about. But now let's take it a step further. Let's now put target tape on the entry wounds of, let's say, the 6 rounds that entered the person's body as they're making this movement. Well, what do you think happens, Brian? Well, now what ends up happening is we get this reveal, if you will, of the entry bullet holes in time and space as this person moves through the validation video. And so you could actually say, oh, there's shot number 1, there's shot number 2, there's shot number 3. And as you're working this person through that motion that you're theorizing, those entry wounds are presenting themselves to the camera one by one at a fairly standard rate. In other words, they're separated in time fairly uniformly. And guess what? That time that they're separated uniformly actually will likely match the time, the shot-to-shot interval between whatever firearm that person was shooting. Pretty wild, huh?
Absolutely. And I think that's the key, is that it's and it seems to me that it goes back to what you talked about before about the team approach, is that we're making so much progress in understanding video, and there's people like Grant Fredericks and Jamie Borden and others that are doing great work to help create forensic video analysis, investigators within agencies, and we have the behavioral psychology piece, and now it seems to me that this is filling in some of those gaps that help us to create this so that we understand exactly what happened and move away from theory, speculation, and now we can, from a scientific and an engineering perspective, have a more clear understanding of what actually happened in the event.
Totally agree, and I'm a big fan of Grant. I'm certified with Input Ace. We have a copy of Input Ace here that we use to at least validate any of the videos that come in-house, and so we make sure that nothing's been changed, the hash hasn't changed, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why we go about analyzing the video in the manner that I just discussed. But yeah, it's super important work.
Absolutely. So you've mentioned a couple of times a course, and I know you have a course coming up at the end of October. Can you talk about that course, talk about what the elements are that you cover in the course, how people might find out about it, how they might register if they're interested in pursuing that? Sure.
We have a 1-hour free version of the Science of Violence starting at 9 a.m. PST on September 30th. That's a Wednesday. But at the end of October, we have a 6-hour version also starting at 9 a.m. on October 28th for 3 hours, and then again on October 29th for 3 hours. And on that file, or in that course, we basically give you a lot more real-world case file examples of how to use this stuff. Because that's the problem. Like, we can give you a tool set, like a carpenter, for example, but unless you apply that tool set creatively and within the realm of, let's say, I mean, I haven't used this analog before, so I'm trying to think what might be best to say, but as long as you don't go outside what would be considered, because you use the word creative, all of a sudden you open a box of spiders. But you have to be able to apply these tools so that you solve the answers, or that you answer the questions that need to addressing. And that always isn't clear to the person that holds the toolbox. As you know, carpenters will solve problems different ways, and sometimes the way forward isn't always clear. And so we try to give you that creativity by showing how it's applied to real world case studies. But then we also do some deep dives. So we'll talk more about video analysis, like I just went through. We'll talk about photogrammetry. We'll talk about injury analysis, for example. It's like, how do I determine the load that caused this femur to fracture? And why is that even important? And so now you have this new, tool set, this new toolkit that you can apply to a specific situation. And it really is about building that tool set. So that's what we try to cover in the October 28th and 29th course there. But of course, that one's not free. It's taking a significant amount of resources to develop it. We have a former police officer online to answer questions during the course. We have one of our lead engineers online to answer technical questions as we go through the webinar. And so it's very well managed that way. If you are interested in taking it, there's Zoom links that we've been shooting out on LinkedIn and other social media platforms, but probably the easiest would be to just email us at admin@gtdscientific.com. That's admin@gtdscientific.com, and we'll shoot you those links, and you can get registered.
Excellent. So that's Golf Tango Delta Scientific.com.
That's correct.
Now, is the target audience for this people that would be doing investigations, and not necessarily just homicide investigators, but anybody that would be looking at doing a use of force investigations, or use of force trainers that often get called in to consult on some of these files that are going on within an agency, to give them a foundational understanding of this engineering piece that would add to their other experience and knowledge base?
That's a great question, Brian. I would say it's geared towards lawyers that tend to deal with violent encounters, whether it's an OIS, police defense, criminal law, etc., and also investigators. And so I would say probably a little bit more heavy on the investigators, in the sense that we really try to give them take-home tools that they can use tomorrow in their investigation. That's really critical. But then I think the lawyers get a lot of use out of it too, because knowing how a technical expert's going to approach a file will allow them to manage their resources better. As you know, there's a finite amount of resources out there, and it's getting more scarce all the time, especially under the current conditions. I mean, there's some municipalities that I believe are close to bankruptcy, and they come to me and they're like, look, we can't pay you until we're getting close to trial. And they're doing that just to defer the payments. And by the way, this is how much it's going to have to cost. And I'm really sorry about that, but that's the budget we have for it. And I'm getting those discussions more and more all the time. It's not like we're going up against a private entity in a plaintiff's file where they have millions of dollars to pull from. And unfortunately, those are the numbers that are being asked of these municipalities when there is an OIS. And so it's got to come from somewhere. And so we get that. And I think this course helps them understand first of all, the approach that might be taken, how much that approach is going to cost. And then if you can better understand your expert report, you can better vet your experts. And so on top of that, it would allow them to choose their experts more wisely.
Excellent. Great explanation. And I would encourage trainers that are involved in teaching use of force and control tactics and those other elements to consider it as well, to add to that foundation of knowledge, because, again, very often they're being consulted by internal affairs investigators or senior leadership from their organization about some of these issues, and that foundational knowledge would be of tremendous value. So is the best way then for people to reach out to find out not only more about the course, but if they want to follow up with you or if they want to engage you through that admin at gtdscientific.com, or is there a better way for people to access information about what you do and your company?
You could go to our website at gtdscientific.com. That's a good starting point. A lot of our publications are publicly available there. If you go to our publications area, you can just download things that have been published there. Admin at GTD Scientific is always good, or you can just give me a call. I'll give anyone 30 minutes, and my number here is 604-842-4831. Again, that's 604-842-4831. I'd be happy to talk to you.
Excellent. And again, you're on Pacific Standard Time, just if people are trying to figure out the time difference from where you're at and where Jeff is at. So great information, Jeff. One question I'm asking everybody at the end of the interviews for Season 3 is, what's one piece of advice that you received, or a concept or philosophy that you were exposed to in your career as a trainer that helped you to become a better trainer?
Great question. And the more we get into these webinars and teaching internally and now externally, I think the most useful tool that I've come across to really have these concepts sink in is priming. You've got to get your concepts out really early, even if they're in bite-sized chunks, because the subconscious will start to process it, the conscious will start to process it, to kind of understand what's coming, and then that information just builds and builds and builds and builds. So the way we do that is to give them reading material ahead of time, to make sure they know that what the day is going to look like, or what the seminar is going to look like, what topics we'll actually be covering. And I'll spend a little bit of time, maybe just a few minutes, describing what that topic's actually going to be. So now they've seen it, now they've heard it, they've read a little bit about it before they've come in. And so by the time we actually start to really dig in, this is now the third time they've seen this content. And I find there's much better take home when we approach training that way.
Excellent. Great piece of advice, and I think we're starting to talk more about the importance of priming as a strategy in training overall. So, Jeff, I want to thank you for making time for the interview, but more importantly, I want to thank you for the important work that you're doing and your commitment to getting involved in helping the law enforcement profession, understanding some of these critical issues, and bringing that area of science and engineering to our understanding of these violent encounters to help us better do investigations and better move forward in prosecutions or in court cases. So for everything that you have done, everything you continue to do, thank you so much for that service. You bet, Brian. My pleasure. It's a tough job. So anything we can do to help is absolutely my pleasure. And I appreciate that. So, and again, I want to offer a thank you to the listeners. Thank you for being an ILEETA member. Thank you for being a trainer. As a trainer, you are in one of the most influential leadership positions in this profession. And being a good trainer is a lot of work, and I thank you for making that commitment. I encourage you to let the information that Jeff shared, and he shared a lot of great information, let that information simmer, percolate overnight, and then be intentional about sitting down, writing out your greatest takeaways, writing out your action steps. What actions are you going to take to implement this information or to reach out and get more training on it so that you have a greater understanding. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this interview. I trust that you found value in the information shared during the interview. To join a community of thousands of trainers who are committed to advancing law enforcement training and get full access to all the benefits of being an ILEETA member, go to ILEETA.org, that's ILEETA.org, and click on the members link, then on the membership application. If you have 3 or more trainers in your training cadre, then please consider contacting our Director of Operations, Jenny Merlin, at jmerlin, that's JMERLIN, at ILEETA.org for information on bundle memberships.